Here in Georgia, as in the whole of the Soviet Union, we have lived without God for over 70 years. Churches were closed, and it was even dangerous to admit to being a believer.
Georgians belonged to one of the oldest nations in Christendom. According to legend, Elijah's cloak was kept in Georgia, left here by Jews who were hiding from persecutions meted out by Nebuchadnezzar. The beginnings of Christianity in Georgia go back to the 1st century, when the first apostles arrived here and set up Christian communities. According to tradition passed down through the ages by word of mouth, the first leaders included the Apostle Andrew, as well as Bartholomew and Matthew. A legend holds that the Virgin Mary was assigned to proclaim the good news in Georgia.
According to legend, Mary was present when the apostles got together to decide who was to go to which country to proclaim the gospel, and Georgia fell to her. However, Our Lady was taken up to heaven and thus was unable to go there, and so the apostles went instead. That is why there is such a strong cult of Our Lady in Georgia. When someone asks whether I am a missionary in Georgia, I sometimes mischievously answer that I am not a missionary, because Georgia, after all, has been a Christian country for over 1600 years.
Georgia became a Christian country thanks to Saint Nino and the king and queen, Saints Miriam and Nana. They were all active in Kartli, today's Georgia, at the turn of the 3rd and 4th centuries. During her stay in Jerusalem, Nino had a vision in which she saw Our Lady sending her to preach the gospel in the Caucasus. She ended up as a slave at the court of King Miriam of Kartli, which is where she is claimed to have miraculously cured the king's seriously ill wife, Nana. In recognition of this achievement, the king duly converted to Christianity.
When Nino arrived in Georgia, she took 2 grapevine twigs, which she intertwined into her hair and arranged in the shape of a cross, the basis of the famous St. Nino cross, which also happens to be very similar to the Holy Cross that was used by Pope John Paul II. Legends as well as oral tradition attribute many miracles and healings to her, which in turn led to a powerful and swift conversion of the Georgian nation, as well as the firm establishment of Christianity in Georgia.
The Greeks were the first Christian communities in the 2nd century and the first Christians in Georgia. In the 5th century, the Iberian Church was granted autocephalous status and its own patriarch. The Church became divided following the conquest of Georgia by Byzantium and Islam, but then united following the reunification of the country in the 11th century. The situation became more complicated in the 15th century when both Turkey and Persia successively attacked Georgia, both bent on the Islamization of the region. The situation remained unchanged up until the 19th century and the rule of the Tsars, when, though allowed the building of churches, Catholics were still unable to enjoy full freedom of belief.
Georgia was annexed by Russia in the 19th century. The plight of Catholics in the 19th century was intriguing because of the country's noticeable cultural development. For example, 19th century Catholicism left Georgia with a great cultural legacy. We have many great Catholic innovators, both in the arts and sciences, as well as music.
Though Georgian independence came with the fall of Tsarist Russia, it lasted only briefly from 1918 to 1921. Independence ended when the Red Army invaded the country in 1921, unleashed a bloody terror, and incorporated Georgia into the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic. The Church suffered immense losses at the time in human terms, through imprisonment, deportations, and executions, as well as materially, following the confiscation, destruction, and blowing up of church property. The church practice, in effect, became impossible. Communist rule held sway in the Soviet republics, including Georgia, right up to the early 90s. The Soviet system, not unlike all other totalitarian systems, sought to vindicate the failure of its economic and social policies by apportioning blame to an internal as well as external threat. The Catholic Church proved eminently suitable for this purpose, regarded by the communist system as enemy number one.
We were brought up in communist times to be atheists. Teachers said that there was no God. They taught us that only power and natural law existed, subject to scientific study in order to determine the basis and framework of life. I was born in 1965, at a time that can be described as entrenched communism, when all churches were firmly closed. I can remember how we liked to play, here, in the vicinity of this church. We were always very glad when they opened it. During the year, the communists would come a couple of times and bring grain and other items to store here. The church was used as a warehouse. We could then go inside and play. Entry was forbidden, so people who wanted to pray would gather in a building that stood next to the church, called the priest's house. Everything was arranged as inside a church, except that there was no priest. There was a hall where people gathered throughout communist times. On Sunday, grandmothers would come with small children. They weren't allowed to bring older school children. They primarily recited the rosary.
We came here to the church and prayed in front of the church door. We never denied our faith. We came, prayed, and sang. The agricultural cooperative stored wheat in this church. I also brought the wheat here myself, as I worked there at the time. They later stored corn. The church slowly fell into disrepair, and then the floor began to rot.
My parents worked in a school. They couldn't talk freely about their faith. I remember when we used to drive from Valẽ into town. We used to pass a beautiful church on the way. We used to go inside and pray, light a candle, and then drive on. Nobody could learn about this, because you could be thrown out of work. I don't remember the event, but my parents recounted how they took me to Tbilisi in secret and had me baptized in a Catholic church. I knew I was a Catholic from that moment.
Catholics, having suffered greatly under communist rule, now number only about 50,000. In Tbilisi, throughout the communist period, Catholics had only one church, St. Peter and Paul's Church. This church, for lack of Georgian priests, was managed by one single Polish priest, who suffered persecutions for his devotion to the faith.
I wasn't allowed to teach the catechism in church. They used to say, "The Orthodox don't teach, so neither will you." I didn't listen to them. Came in one year, went out the next. I did what I had to do, and that was that. When I mentioned this to the bishop, he advised, "If people come, teach them to the best of your ability. Teach the catechism and dispense the sacraments. Do everything to the best of your ability." Father Jan Śnieżyński and 2 Eucharistic nuns stayed together here for 25 hard years, during Brezhnev's, Chernenko's, and whoever else's time, Andropov's. And thanks to these people, beaten and persecuted, this church and community survived. I remember how Father Jan recounted how he was beaten during the night interrogations. People such as Father Śnieżyński should become cardinals. It's thanks to such people that nobody remembers or talks about that the church has survived here. These people gave their lives for this church, on this land, in this place, in this country.
In 1991, a newly independent Georgia emerged, battered from the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Once an affluent part of the USSR, the deteriorating relations between Georgia and Russia soon resulted in the disintegration of the Georgian economy. Healthcare in Georgia, once the envy of the Soviet Union, collapsed. Georgians, once used to inexpensive energy from the USSR, were confronted with rampant prices and energy cuts. Manufacturing, dependent on the near-exclusive trade with the USSR, crumbled with an explosion in unemployment and profound poverty. This economic collapse was mirrored by a moral collapse.
There was no private property here for 70 years. There was practically no church for 70 years. People weren't taught religion or the commandments or about spiritual fundamentals or moral ones. Nobody taught us, for who was to do it? Great confusion reigned in people's consciences between what is just, morally acceptable, and what is socially admissible. To create a real evangelical consciousness became a real problem. To the problem of people's ability to distinguish right from wrong, one must also add man's sinful nature. A relativization of the human person came about. There are cultures that not so much viewed the individual, but rather the family or group as the foundation of society structure. All this had disappeared and the human person became something relative.
Una realtà molto relativa.
I very often talk with all sorts of acquaintances and friends. They tell me that not everything in communism was bad. For example, healthcare had value and was available to everyone. The state, the system guaranteed it. However, that system, the Soviet, communist one that we are talking about, erased certain human values. They were somehow lost, mislaid. These general problems are relics of 70 years of communism, of a life without God, of this Homo Sovieticus, who said one thing, thought another, then did something completely different. That mentality somehow survives, and indeed life continues without any reference to either conscience or faith. All this continues to this day. It's firstly the fault of a lack of ideology, and then of a communist ideology that replaced religion.
Rodzina według mnie tu prawie że nie istnieje.
In my judgment, the family is practically non-existent here. Very many men are unfaithful to their wives, and often vice versa. There are very many divorces, and on that basis suffice to say that the family is disintegrating. Reason enough for the large number of abortions and illegitimate children. Presently, more young people than before live outside of marriage, and though they come here to church, to youth meetings, for them it is normal, and I can see that we have no influence over them. It is painful for me personally, because in simple human terms, our work here has been futile.
Communism in Georgia has on the one hand led to the disappearance of any spiritual or religious life, whilst on the other to a total collapse of the economy. The majority of huge factories have been closed and many workplaces lost, leaving thousands of Georgians without a job. Unemployment and shocking poverty have grown to unimaginable levels.
Ci ludzie wegetują.
These people just vegetate. And there is so much poverty, because refugees who have come from the villages in search and in the hope of finding a better life in the bigger cities have found none. Presently in Georgia, only memories survive of the huge communist factories that used to employ tens of thousands. We are presently on the site of one of the largest of those former factories that apparently employed over 12,000 people, an entire district of which presently nothing survives.
Z tej fabryki nic nie zostało.
Broken up, sold off, so-called privatization. Your house is burned down, you've lost your job or fallen ill. The state doesn't care, there's nothing. No benefits or pensions, only an allowance of 80 lari. What can you buy in Georgia for 80 lari? A little over €1 a day.
To jest trochę więcej jak €1 dziennie.
It has to be said that people are very poor. If my average Sunday collection amounts to 12 lari, about €4, then that is a large collection. This was the first Mass in this church, so the collection was very large, 27 lari, about €9. There's no sense in comparing conditions elsewhere. People here are very poor.
Poverty, unemployment, and a lack of any prospects for the future are the reasons for the growth in economic immigration, especially among young Georgians, and a direct consequence of a fall in the number of inhabitants from 5 to just under 4 million people.
Over 500,000 Georgians have gone to Europe or America. They are undoubtedly fascinated by the Western lifestyle and the standard of living of those societies. That fascination with the West is visible everywhere, but especially in the villages. I'll give you an example. When I come to a village to celebrate Holy Mass and a Brazilian soap opera happens to be broadcast on television, then I have to wait until the film ends. Only then can I celebrate Holy Mass. These films often become the church's visiting cards. There's much talk about them in how the priest gives quick divorces. Thereafter, some people imagine, including Orthodox members of the clergy, that quick divorces in the Catholic Church are possible, which is something that they of course find shocking.
Przed laty jeździliśmy do kościoła co niedzielę i było małżeństwo.
Several years ago, we used to drive to church every Sunday. There were a couple with 2 daughters there. They came to church, once with one daughter, once with the other. One Sunday, I unthinkingly simply asked, "Why do you always come to church with one daughter?" They were stunned by my questions. I immediately realized that I had said something wrong. They explained they only had one pair of shoes.
In 1990 ushered in a new era in Georgia. Freedom of belief was proclaimed. The Catholic Church was gradually reborn. Priests, mainly from Italy and Poland, came to rebuild ruined parishes, whilst Georgia established diplomatic relations with the Holy See in 1993. However, Georgian Catholics remain widely dispersed throughout the country, usually in small, out-of-the-way villages, which makes pastoral work very difficult.
Il 1987.
My first visit to a Georgian village was in 1987. The bells tolled, and all the women came in from the fields bringing flowers and singing a hymn that they had learned from an Armenian Catholic priest who had brought it to Georgia from Turkey 150 years earlier. It was a song to Our Lady.
Era un canto alla Madonna. E anche quello è stato un avvenimento, era la prima volta che vedevano un vescovo.
It was the first time they had seen a bishop. There were tears and emotions, but above all a sentence that many repeated. We cannot believe that the Pope knows that we are still alive.
Sappia che siamo ancora vivi.
In quel momento, nel 94,
In 1994, my superior asked me and another priest to go to Georgia, where there were only a handful of priests. When we arrived, the apartment we rented had electricity, water, and a gas supply. Within 3 months, there was no electricity, water, or gas supply. We had to heat ourselves with a stove, cook on the stove as well as draw water into a bucket.
si doveva scaldarsi con
To all that, the difficulties of learning a new language. Such were the beginnings. After some 3 to 4 months of study, the then nuncio decided to send us directly to Kutaisi to begin work in the western part of Georgia. We began by trying to bring the first Catholics together. When we arrived in Georgia, the beginnings, though hard, imbued us with enthusiasm. We began with the sign of the cross in the name of the Father and the Son. One thing that I believe was very moving was that many people, especially in the villages, still remembered the Hail Mary, though not the Holy Mass.
Molta gente, specialmente nei paesi, si ricordava l'Ave Maria.
We began with prayer meetings. Several months later, we started to catechize. Then came the first Mass, after which the first small communities began to take shape. Those were the beginnings.
Creare le piccole comunità. Ecco, questo è stato l'inizio.
It was winter when I arrived here for the first time with a Bernardine priest. The church was full of people during workdays every day, because this was all for them, because a priest had come to them. They had had no priest from the 1930s, so for them it was something really wonderful.
Naprawdę cudownego.
People had forgotten the rite of the Holy Mass. When one of the priests arrived in the 1990s and began to celebrate the Holy Mass, based on changes introduced by the Second Vatican Council, in other words, when he began to celebrate the Holy Mass facing the congregation, people were much surprised, because they had been used, especially older people who remember the pre-council rite, to the Holy Mass being celebrated with the priest with his back to the congregation.
Ja pamiętam takie zdarzenie.
I remember one event following the opening of the nunciature in Tbilisi in 1994. A delegation of 4 people arrived from Kutaisi. They came to ask for a Catholic priest to come to them because they had not a single priest. Those who had come remembered that either their grandmother or grandfather or other member of the family were Catholic, which is why they wanted that church reborn.
To byli katolicy.
That was the beginning of the 90s. Archbishop Tadeusz Kondruszewicz had been designated by the Pope as the apostolic administrator for Catholics inhabiting the European part of Russia. I travelled for the bishop's enthronement in Moscow. I also noted down all the addresses that I had, all my Catholic contacts. I later learned that the bishop had parish priests installed at those locations.
Ja byłem w Valẽ proboszczem.
I was a parish priest in Valẽ. In the beginning, I was unable to get the local parishioners to give me the key of the church. Others claimed that whoever attended church would receive $100 from me, from the Vatican, that I wanted to steal the gold from the church. They saw me order an organ for the church. They saw me bring a new tabernacle from Poland and other things. It was only then that they understood that I had not come to rob them, but to serve them.
Żeby coś dla siebie zdobyć, ale żeby nam służyć.
One moment, please. I have to write everything down. Where are you from? From Tbilisi. Has your wife been to confession? Yes, she has. When? About a year ago, I believe. I have to visit her so that she can confess and receive Holy Communion. Father Misha has been. Father Misha was here? When? A week ago. Good. Thank God. Father, it's hard for me to say, but if I come again, will Father give me more of those pampers? If I have any of them, I will give you. See you. All right, good.
Before the communist period, Georgia numbered 90,000 to 100,000 Catholics. But after 70 years of an atheist Soviet system, today there is only one Georgian priest in Georgia. The others are Poles and Italians who are translating the Roman liturgy into the Georgian language.
Jeździłem raz w miesiącu.
I used to drive to the village of Kachetia. There was no mass there, only catechesis. There were only a few old ladies and a few children. 8 to 10 young people and a Georgian translator for me. We ran the first catechesis, translated Polish workbooks into Georgian so that local catechists could help us. By the time I had to leave, after 7 years of service, 2/3 of the faithful were children and young people, so it remains to the present.
Wielu księży, kolegów mnie
Many priests and friends urge me to stop this work and leave. But how can one leave these people? Perhaps if there are enough local priests, I might leave. But how can I leave them now? After all, they need a priest.
potrzebują księdza.
The scars of 70 years of state atheism combined with increasing materialism and secularization has resulted in a lack of vocations to the priesthood. The Church, in its efforts to reach out to the dispersed faithful, relies heavily on the work of local catechists.
I remember when I arrived in Georgia, there was just one catechist for the whole of Georgia, whilst I recently bestowed diplomas on 45 freshly trained catechists, in other words, on people who had completed a 2-year preparatory course. I would go so far as to claim that because of a shortage of priests, they find it easier to assume their responsibilities.
The Catholic Church is everything for me. When I go inside my church, I feel as if I was in my own home.
I feel that I am very strong within, on a higher level, my spirit ever stronger.
Holy Mass on a Sunday charges me with energy for the whole week. I wait for Sunday with impatience to strengthen myself.
The Catholic Church truly helps us a lot.
Trzy lata temu w niedzielę tutaj
3 years ago, only 3 or 4 men attended Holy Mass on a Sunday. Presently, there are at least 20. They're still a bit ashamed of going to church. They laugh at each other afterwards, but we had catechesis with the men. The first men's rosary group in Georgia is based here.
tutaj mężczyzn.
The spiritual thirst among a population devoid of faith for generations is a significant challenge for those recently ordained to the priesthood. Father Zurab, the first Georgian priest ordained after the communist collapse, has worked in the region of Valẽ for several years. It is only now that he sees the fruits of his pastoral work, a growing interest and deepening faith amongst the young.
Father Zurab is very involved in his work with young people. With a great enthusiasm, he organizes outings and excursions. For the girls, singing and dancing contests, and for the boys, inter-regional and national sports competitions. Meetings for all Catholic youth in Georgia. He also organizes groups of altar servers, as well as catechesis for children and young people. They're very interested in that. Priests have to put everything right to make up for those 70 lost years. A priest's job, first and foremost, is to reach out to people, because not everybody comes to church. Secondly, to somehow reach out into their way of thinking, to their hearts, to seek to understand how they live. A priest's job also comes down to not denouncing anybody, or to say, look here, it's Sunday and you are not in church, so you are committing a grave sin, but rather to talk in a way that is understandable to all. It is important for a priest working here to appreciate those he is to serve, people with practically no foundation of faith.
Fundamentul wiary nie ma.
The specific nature of the resurgent Catholic Church in Georgia is that most participants are either old people or children. Sunday Holy Mass often becomes an opportunity for a social gathering.
Dla niektórych może być moda.
Some come out of courtesy, others because it's fashionable, especially young people, because they can meet here, because Valẽ has no cinema or theatre, no places to which young people can go and have fun. There is only one school and that's it. When the Gospel is read or we are on our knees, they gossip at the back and so on. No wonder. One must be patient with them, as well as with those who are at work on a Sunday. Be patient and patiently wait, sometimes for years, with the hope that years of reflection will ultimately bear fruit.
Jakieś skutki.
Rodzice w ogóle nie chodzą.
Parents, by and large, do not attend Holy Mass here, whilst the children come. That for me is a miracle, truly a miracle of God's grace. If I remember correctly, the first Holy Communion took place in Valẽ in 1998. It was the very first, attended by about 20 children. One mother was present, no father, whilst the rest were grandmothers. Yet they continued to attend afterwards. They persevered. Not everybody, but the majority. That for me is a miracle of God's love of these people.
Miłości Bożej do tych ludzi.
Priests working in Georgia are doing their utmost to strengthen Georgian Catholics in their faith. Following a mass return of people to the church, there is now a mass exodus of the faithful away from religious practices. Priests, nuns and Catholic volunteers work in Georgia on many levels, spiritual as well as charitable. The fact, however, remains that this is but a drop in the ocean of needs.
The church that lives on this land needs help. I'm grateful to aid to the church in need because it supports us in matters that I believe are key to the future. We are determined to ensure that the money we receive from various churches should be wisely spent. Religious orders such as the Camillians, Sisters of St. Joseph, Mother Teresa's sisters, present here, the Salesian nuns, all are engaged in charitable works here. I think that these three legs of the Catholic Church, formation, catechization, preaching of the good news, charity and liturgy, are present without any doubt in our church.
The dramatic plight of Catholics of the Caucasus was always close to the then Pope John Paul II, who visited Georgia in 1999 at the official invitation of President Eduard Shevardnadze. Georgia's Orthodox Church was against the visit to begin with, mainly because there was practically no ecumenical dialogue in Georgia to speak of at the time. The Patriarch forbade his faithful to attend Catholic Holy Mass, renounced Catholic Holy Baptism, and regarded the Pope as a politician.
Georgia was the first country in the Caucasus to welcome the Pope at the invitation of the President and not the Patriarch. We Georgians are Christians from the 4th century. From the 4th century. John Paul II knew and understood that very well. When he came to Tbilisi, his knowledge of Georgian history amazed me. He not only knew the history of the Georgian nation, but also of Armenia and that of many other countries and nations. Our Patriarch had doubts to begin with. He wavered, but later, after 2 or 3 meetings, he said that I was right, and that it would be good if the Pope came to visit Georgia. The meeting was very cordial, the conversation very friendly. As for everybody else, so also for the Patriarch, this was an exceptional occasion. Crowds stood out on the streets, which shocked everybody. Nobody expected that so many people would stand and wait for the Holy Father. There were truly thousands of people. I remember it as if it was today. That is Father Dziwisz saying, "Had we known that so many people would come, we would have brought the Papamobile, so that people could see the Pope." There were, I don't know, tens of thousands of people. It was raining, November, cold and windy. Nobody drove them to it. Nobody forced them. Nobody encouraged them. When the Holy Father was celebrating Holy Mass in the sports hall, the radio warned that whoever was Orthodox and attended Mass would be committing a grave sin. When I had to go about organizing the visit together with the Patriarch, I repeatedly asked if, when the Pope comes, the 2 Patriarchs, the Pope, Patriarch of the West, and the Patriarch of Georgia, could say some prayer together. But it turned out not to be possible. I responded by saying, why is it impossible for Peter and Andrew to pray together?
Pietro e Andrea non riescono a fare una preghiera.
The Orthodox side did not want to hear of any joint prayer, even Our Father. They lit candles, a gesture, a symbol. However, the fact of their meeting, of being together in this place, the heads of the Catholic Church and Georgia's Orthodox Church, is important for me. And that they met and talked in private in the Patriarch's residence. The conversation was very personal and friendly. And more than just that, it went beyond our boldest expectations. I believe that Georgia and Georgians welcomed the Holy Father, even though the propaganda, the radio wasn't always sympathetic or positively inclined. There were, in effect, no negative consequences. No consequences. Perhaps, in fact, the opposite.
Żadnego skutku to nie miało, żadnego skutku, a może przeciwny nawet.
Restitutions remains both a painful and very difficult matter to resolve. Immediately after the fall of communism, the Orthodox Church took possession of 5 Catholic churches, including those in Kutaisi, Gori and Batumi. These Catholic shrines, built by the ancestors of today's Catholic community of faithful, were converted into Orthodox churches. A joint commission set up to deal with the most burning issues between Catholics and Orthodox, including the matter of repossessed churches and the recognition of Catholic baptisms, has been in session on only 2 occasions, without coming to any agreement on any of the key issues.
The Orthodox Church does not recognize our baptism. As a consequence, it cannot regard us as Christians, because if it does not recognize my baptism, then I am not a Christian. Notwithstanding a variety of suggested explanations, our church remains officially unrecognized here in Georgia.
Stiamo noi giuridicamente. Penso che la presenza della Chiesa cattolica
I believe that the presence of the Catholic Church here in Georgia is a great sign of divine grace,
per la Chiesa cattolica solo
not only for the Catholic Church, but also for the Orthodox Church. We take pains to find common ground, to be united. Our mission as Catholics is to find this common ground, to find common points that will enable us to go forward,
faremo di passi in avanti.
step by step.
La nostra missione come cattolici.
Myślę, że
I believe that we should try to do everything to have good relations with the Orthodox Church. Sometimes one has to pretend not to see, hear, or remember something. We need to find a place for the Catholic Church in this country, because it had been here many centuries ago. It is not the case that we arrived here with the fall of communism. No, we were here centuries ago. The Catholic Church has been here for centuries. Always a minority, and let it stay that way.
i niech tak zostanie.
Qui in Georgia non abbiamo la missione di fare
Here in Georgia, we don't want Orthodox to become Catholic. However, communion between the two churches remains our mission, as well as ensuring that Catholics become decent Catholics. That is my responsibility, and for the Orthodox to ensure that they become decent Orthodox.
diventano dei bravi ortodossi. Ma io ricordo quando
I remember when I first went to visit John Paul II, after my appointment as Apostolic Administrator, and asked him, "Can Your Holiness dedicate a few words to me personally? I will keep them to myself in my heart." He looked at me and said, "Patience, patience, patience, and patience."
pazienza e pazienza. Ecco,
I realized that over the years that word has helped me look at all things, both when things were beautiful and when they were ugly, and say, one has to go forward with patience.
dire bisogna andare avanti con pazienza.
Naprawdę
Truly, as a church, or as churches, we have a lot to do here. This is a terra conosciuta. This remains a land to discover. Truly an immense opportunity for action. For having saved but one human being, one life, we have saved the whole world.
jedno życie to jest cały świat.
I